Thank you very much, Naomi, and everybody else who's participated, the speakers, all the organisers, Hausfeld and Bickel and Callum and his team too, who have made this event possible, who've joined in various ways to make it vibrant. And I hope in order to create some kind of momentum behind the ideas we've discussed here. Bear in mind also, we want to pursue this notion of a declaration and deliver it to leaders at COP26. Partly to encourage further action, and as Mary says, action builds trust, more action. There's a circularity about that. We want to contribute in various ways. I said I'd go back over some of the questions that were asked yesterday that we didn't get to. And in conclusion, I want to pick up a couple that were advanced. Gerd Winter sent in a really good question. Peter Frumhoff sent in a really good question. And they were questions about the capacity of the legal system to respond quickly enough, adequately enough to the scale of the challenge. The encouragement perhaps to self-organize, to build communities of interest, perhaps using the language of the law, but less dependent on formal processes. The idea that because these issues transcend national boundaries and we're still experimenting on how to do global governance, there might be scope for other forms of experimentation, but particularly around the notion of inalienable human rights that, of course, transcend natural boundaries and have to do with us as humans. And the overall objective of all of this talk about law and climate change is ultimately to build healthy, just, and thriving societies. That there's a prize out there for doing this right. It's not a technical task simply to take greenhouse gas emissions out of the atmosphere, to draw down, as we will need to do, but also to transform the way we think, the way we talk about our obligations to each other in a society that is clearly and obviously under threat. That's the nature of an existential threat. That's the sort of situation we are really in, because the real world facts are that we are in an emergency. It is that serious. It's not a conversation about why we might need to act on this particular imperative over a period of time because it's sensible to do that. It's more pressing than that. And it has been for decades. I've worked on it for 30 years and others before that. So when we confront young activists who are motivated by fear and rage often, but also want real solutions, they want to feel hope, but they need to feel that hope is coming out of a genuine commitment to act, otherwise you're asking too much of them. And that intergenerational connection has been very present in our conversation over the last 2 days. We've also had great range and diversity in the understanding of law, the application of law in particular jurisdictions. We know we want law to lend power to that effort to transform our societies so that they are safe and can prosper and be resilient in the face of climate change. But we recognize that this is not a pure top-down solution. There'll be all sorts of different ways to advance the case. And we've learned of all sorts of ways in which judges might act that interpret separation of powers in different ways and sometimes compensate for weak institutions in their own countries. We've certainly learned that interpretation is a powerful device for avoiding some of the apparent conflicts between various branches of government, because courts have that power. And indeed, the world is made in our minds. Interpretation is everything. That's how we make sense of the world. And language is our special power as a species. So insofar as we can reinterpret the world that we are in, because we understand climate change, and use language which grounds our response in our inalienable human rights, we will alter the way courts decide cases that involve climate change issues. And as we started off right at the beginning with Johann's intervention, we are constrained by hard physical science boundaries. That is our constraint. Now, we can be creative in the face of it. We can do that. We are very adaptable, but those physical boundaries impinge and need to be reflected in the language of the law. So it's perhaps appropriate that if we focus on ourselves as a species, but also our connection with other species, we learn techniques of survival from those other species. We know that species cooperate just as much as they compete in order to get a foothold and thrive in an ecosystem. And situating climate action in that context allows us to feel that connection with ourselves, but also with the other parts of the natural system upon which we depend for our survival. And because law does, as we discussed yesterday, transform natural power into legal power, therefore allowing access to the power of law to deliver public goods, even in the face of abusive or transgressive power in the hands of an incumbent, whether it's a political power or corporate power, or even an institution that's supposed to deliver the public good, but isn't, then I think we have greater potential to fix this problem within the generation that we have and not leave generations behind with the major burden of coping with an unresolved problem. So in a sense, our future, how we express, depends in large part on how we express our political will in the language of the law, and how we reshape our financial and economic markets in order effectively to save us from ourselves. Let me bring this to a conclusion with some hope that we can use this very particular moment where we have a crisis that has taught us the threat that comes from non-linear risk, from exponential risks to ourselves. It has made a connection between us as humans, also revealed our failures to properly act in the interest of the whole, although there's still time yet, shall we say. And also the time when we gather for COP26, a delayed COP, where raised ambition is the key and central agenda item, but where we simply do not have time for more general promises and good intentions in the future, where we want to see obligations set in law, implementable, actionable, enforceable, with courts that are open to people of all types, so that our interests as citizens are adequately protected by those who serve us and by the legal system of which we are an essential part. Let me end there. Let me thank you all. Let me thank those who made it all possible, and hope that we continue our conversation, keep close, keep connected, and find ways of expressing ourselves in the language of the law in our own interests.